Some writers live in fear and dread of their books being turned into films. How did you enjoy Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy?
Well, Tinker Tailor is pretty much the exception. I loved it. If I were going to keep one film version of my work, this would be it. That's partly because it was a masterclass to work with guineas. And partly, I think, we caught a wave in history, which was very interesting for the audience. And we were particularly helped in Britain because we had a strike in independent television. So the BBC, quite against its expectation, was receiving these huge audiences. So the thing became, Tinker Tailor became at that time a kind of iconic production, and radio was full of whether anybody understood it and that kind of thing. But this came as near, I feel, as near to my imagining as any film has come. When Flaubert, the French writer, was asked whether he wanted Madame Bovary illustrated, he replied in horror, no, because he didn't want to interfere with the imaginative process of the audience, that everybody would have their own Bovary for as long as there were no illustrations. And I think I felt much the same. The genius of Guinness, it seems to me, in both the series, was to leave the character of Smiley intact for the individual imagination. He suggested the possibilities of Smiley as well as the reality. And in that sense, it was an almost mystical performance, I think.
And how did the other characters portray themselves to you? Were they very much as you imagined the other minor characters to be?
Yes, I think I wanted the English social comedy to be encapsulated in that Secret Service organization. And I wanted the gradations of English class to be explicit, the gents and the non-gents, the upstarts and so on, as we awful Brits see people, or used to in those days. All of that was wonderfully reflected, I thought. And once we had Alec, once we had Guinness's yes to the part, then we could empty the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company. So there wasn't a single lazy piece of casting in the whole production.
I read that Alec Guinness didn't want to accept the role until he'd met you. How did you persuade him to take the part?
Well, Alec was by then quite an old gent, and with an enormous record behind him. He'd never done television before. I think he wanted to make sure that he was in with a sincere production that wasn't going to vulgarize his reputation. I think he reserved himself also in those days, quite simply, the right to work with people he could get on with. He wasn't going to take the kind of dictatorial mayhem that he associated with Hollywood quite often, although he was sufficiently nimble to get round it. So, yes, he wanted to meet me, and he wanted to meet the producer, Jonathan Powell, and he particularly wanted to know that he'd get along with John Irvine. And he was very nervous. He was nervous, and he has this wonderful Eeyore voice that you hear in the... well, I really don't know whether I can do this at all. And one got this in the middle of the night. He'd ring up, "May I speak to Mr. David Cornwell, please?" That's my real name. And I'd say, "Hello, Alec, how did you know it was me?" And I wasn't there. I was there for very little of the shooting. But on the first day of photography, he completely froze. And John Irvine told me that he just, at the end of the day, he said, "I'm absolutely perfectly clear. I'm just absolutely no good for this. Give it to anybody who like. I'll give the money back," and all that stuff. And then the next day, after I think John Irvine had talked to him for a long time, he came into the studio and gave the lens a kiss. And away we went.
Were you able to give him a lot of advice from your own previous experience?
No, I don't think I gave him any advice. I think that I was an orangutan for him. When Alec wanted to watch people and imagine how to communicate their actions and their facial expressions, he'd go to the zoo and watch an orangutan. And an orangutan for him went through all the motions and many of the facial expressions that he wanted to capture. So he pinched a whole lot of things from me. I was conscious he was doing, if I make these kind of gestures, I could see Alec's hairy eyeball tracking me. And then he rang up one day, this was just before we were going to shoot, and I've never met a real spy. Can you possibly put me in touch with that? So I didn't quite know what he meant by this, but I think he wanted a fuss made of him, and he wanted to look at some more zoology. Reassurance. So I rang a man called Sir Maurice Oldfield, who'd been head of the Secret Service, the British Secret Service, and was living, I didn't know it, under a frightful cloud because of his own private behavior and so on. Anyway, he'd been a most distinguished intelligence officer in his time. And we all had lunch together in Chelsea. And when lunch was over, Alec said, "Tell me something." And he seized a water glass. And he said, he held the water glass in his hand, and he said, going round the rim with his finger, "Now," he said, "I've seen people doing that when they're pensive, and I've seen people doing that when they're pensive. But I've never seen people doing that before." He said, "Do you think he's looking for the dregs of poison?" And I think that Alec, like all great artists, was able to keep the child in himself alive. The wonder in him was always open and ready to receive. So that we shot pretty much in sequence. And then the last night, I think it was, the very last night, we were down by the canal. And in the canal house, there is the scene where Alec, with a gun in his hand, is waiting in the dark to see which bad guy steps out from behind the curtain. And then we'll know who the mole is. And my wife and I went and just wished him luck on the last night of shooting down at the canal, and we had everything, cherry pickers. It looked like a great big movie being made. And there was Alec in his underclothes, busy making tactile relationship with the pistol that he was holding, because it's a prop, and he and it had to get to know each other. And he was ruminating, "Now I wonder who it will be. Do you think it'll be? Do you think it'll be?" And then he ran through the cast. "No, I don't think it'll be Roy Bland." "Well, it could be." And then, "Oh dear, well, I hope it isn't that rather nasty Bill Hayden." And he was, it's the controlled schizophrenia of acting. And it's so close to the writing process that it was just completely fascinating. And to wake him from that self-induced coma would have been a great crime. So heaven knows what would have happened. I said, "Alec, for God's sake, you know the script better than everybody else does. You know everybody else's lines. You know who did it." But that would have been saying that Father Christmas didn't exist anymore.
Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was very much about deceit and betrayal. What is it about those themes that the viewer, the reader, finds so attractive, do you think?
Well, it was the time of great betrayal. The Cold War was really a game of loyalty, and it was a question always, the question I tried to stretch in the story, between personal and collective loyalty, what you owed to Caesar, what you owed to your country, and what you owed to your own sense of ethics and morality. And the Cold War was fought under a constant mystery. How much can we do in defense of a free and decent society and remain a free and decent society that is worth defending? So there was always a very great unease, particularly in the secret world, about the methods with which we protected our virtues, we saw it. And this put strains on people's loyalty. And very many of the people from those days had experienced the very real rise of communism as an alternative system, social system, in the 30s. It was an issue then put aside, rather, during the 39-45 war, when Russia was our allies. And there were many people who came out of the 39-45 war thinking that peace really could break out in the world, and we would have some kind of universal socialism, which would be at home in Soviet Russia and fan out from there. And so there was great suspicion everywhere. Once the defectors and the spies came to light in our country, the Burgesses and McLeans, in America, for instance, Alger Hiss, if he was a spy, but also their big spies. And then there was McCarthyism and the great witch hunt. And then inside the CIA, there emerged the absolutely extraordinary figure, I think probably the mad figure, of James Jesus Angleton, as he was called, who was the high priest of the belief, the conviction, that every foreign secret service and most foreign governments that were theoretically on our side were penetrated by communist spies. And this vast conspiracy theory, for a while, dominated the Pentagon and the White House and Capitol Hill. And everything was perceived as an intelligence victory. Through the eyes of Angleton was perceived as a tremendously clever piece of chicken feed, a deception. And the real victory was theirs, and we just didn't know it. And this paranoid doctrine was disseminated by the traveling missionaries of the CIA, who were Angleton's people, and by Angleton himself. And part of the effect of that was that secret services hunted among themselves for their own big traitors. And all sorts of defector material came in to the Americans particularly, which encouraged them in this idea. When you've got a preconception, you can always decorate it with slightly bent intelligence. But some of it was true. And in my early days in the secret world, the thing you noticed quite definitely was the atmosphere of mutual suspicion. And as I know now, I didn't know at the time because I was a very junior worm, there was a suspicion that Sir Roger Hollis, who was the head of the security service, our MI5, was a Russian agent. Utter nonsense. That Graham Mitchell, his number 2, who was a world chess champion, was also a Russian agent. He had his turn. One person after another came under the investigative spotlight, in a sense, in the hope that we could toss his head to the Americans and say, now we've found him, are you happy? Can we trade on the intelligence market again? One really has to see intelligence, particularly at this period in history that we're now describing in Tinker Tailor, as a vast, submerged international commerce, where size doesn't matter. You can be a small country like Israel or Britain with a big source, and you'll be at the high table. You've broken a great code. You've got a great human source somewhere. And that's your ticket of entry to power. And there was a huge amount of intelligence trading and a huge amount of assessing the person with whom you were trading, your trading partner, in order to establish whether he or she was fit to receive the intelligence you had so expensively gathered, and what you would gain by giving that person the intelligence. And there was a period when our foreign services and our embassies seemed, for those who were involved, like a vast cover, a shell, for the real Cold War that was going on underneath.